preliminary thank yous. Thank you certainly to Barry and the rest of the committee for thinking to invite me. Thank you to all of you for coming out this evening in what I understand are quite large numbers. And a special thank you for encouraging me to share this talk, through which 3 days ago I discovered something that I had suspected but had never been able to corroborate for 20, as Barry said, 25 years. So if I hadn't done the preparatory work for this, I still wouldn't know it. And believe me, it's the most wonderful event. My heart soared like an eagle when I discovered this. It'll come out quite early, but without you folks, I would probably never have known. And it was pretty exciting. One question: is this a slide changer? Can we try that? And if so, will it work? Do you know? Or is it just
I doubt it.
Pardon?
I doubt it.
All right. In which case, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I don't know if you'd like to move so you don't have to look at my back, because I have to keep hitting the return key. Is it going to bother? I think it'd probably be more comfortable for you to do that. You folks fine. So what I'm going to do this evening is first fairly briefly review the national significance and look of Highway 20. I think that is necessary. Let's demonstrate just how necessary that is. How many of you know where 20 starts east of here? Okay, for sure. Let's say we're putting $100 on it.
Boston.
Boston. So Boston. Okay, now the $64,000 question: where precisely does it end?
Seattle.
Close to the Pacific Ocean, I mean,
It's the
Newport.
Pacific Ocean, but I said precisely.
Coos Bay. Coos Bay.
Portland.
Newport.
Nobody knows. No,
Newport.
not Portland.
Astoria.
Newport.
No,
Oregon.
no.
Oregon, on the coast, I know that.
It's in Oregon.
Newport.
Newport, Oregon. Correct. Thank you. Since you're a new Mary, I keep my $64,000.
Ringer.
So the fact that it ends in Newport, Oregon, is a major contributory factor for why it has survived as long as it has. So to repeat, I'm going to take a brief look, very brief look at the national picture. Then we'll focus in on some aspects of New York State. I'm not really one for deep history, to be candid with you, even though I was trained as an historical geographer. Some aspects of 20 are rather obvious in terms of following what historically was an important trail across the top tier of the Finger Lakes. So if we went back to the pre-European days, in a sense 20 already existed, although the Six Nations would scarcely say I'm off for the weekend along Highway 20, but nonetheless a trail, yes. Also, as you can see here, or I hope you can see, am I in your way?
Yes.
Okay. As you can see here, a very large part of what became 20 was one of the earliest toll roads in the infant United States, the Cherry Valley Turnpike. That name, of course, is preserved in a later part of 20, which was improved to high-speed highway standards beginning in the late 1920s. As well, if one looks at the road improvement era, the road boosting era in the United States, one has to go back to this road, which actually predates the Lincoln Highway, which is much better known. It's the US 40, of course, 50. This road, the Yellowstone Trail, as it was called, was first conceived in South Dakota in 1912. Was in fact, yes, sir.
We cannot see the screen behind you to see the map. I know what you're talking about.
You're blocking our view.
Right, so
Would it
how are we
help
gonna
if you
do
said-
that? Because I need to be.
Could I do that for you and you
Right,
stand in the
perfect, all right, thank you, thank you, thank you. So,
Thank you.
when I appear to be mildly neo-Nazi, should change the slide.
Is that the right arrow, or down arrow?
It's the return key.
Okay.
It's the smudgy move. Thank you. So the Yellowstone Trail, transnational, as you can see, over much of its length, it wasn't greatly improved. It is noteworthy, however, that a significant share of the Yellowstone Trail followed the line of what is now US 20. 20 officially begins in, well, technically 1925, formally in late fall 1926, when the federal government outlined an entire national system of federal highways, although for many years, many of them were no more than poorly marked dirt roads. But we have our system in place, and interestingly, 20 was supposed to terminate in Seattle. The Washingtonians and Oregonians did not like the proposed route of 20, fought the proposed route, won, and so the federal government backed off a year or so later, and 20, which was supposed, like all of the other multiples of 10, US 30, US 40, US 50, and so on, 20, which was supposed to be transcontinental and supposed to end up in one of the large West Coast cities, was truncated. The feds backed off, and 20 then, between 1926 and 1941, dead-ended at Yellowstone National Park. I should have mentioned earlier that the Yellowstone Trail didn't really go very near to Yellowstone National Park. It was just a nice, attractive, boosting name to make people. If you're in South Dakota, you're not that close to Yellowstone National Park. 20, on the other hand, went straight to Cody, Wyoming, and beyond. It really was, for many years, the main way to get into Yellowstone National Park. So, the road itself, having been the first, or at least one of the first, proposed transcontinentals, was also the last transcontinental to be completed. The stretch in Cascadia here was a big problem to drive a high-speed road through, and still is the most dangerous part of 20 by far. And that made US 20 the last transcontinental, as well as the first, on top of which, for many years, it was the second longest route in the United States. The longest was 50, just before it, by reaching San Francisco. The federal government, through pure whimsy, I think, decided to terminate 50 at Sacramento instead, and so 20, by the stroke of a pen, became America's longest road, and still is, at over 4,300 miles. It begins, well, if you stood there long enough, you might be lucky enough to have a baseball bounce on your head. It's quite close to Red Sox Stadium, near the famous circa sign, which, by the way, is a nationally designated landmark itself. And a friend of mine in Massachusetts was the spearhead to make that historic landmark. And I agree with you to ask any Sox fan how important that sign is. Here we begin not too far from the coast, and we end, I was a little bit disappointed with this the first time, we end one block from the Pacific Ocean. You can see it, I think that's good enough, because you've got a half a mile of beach as well, but it dead ends at the much more famous Highway 101. And it's interstates were conceived, very carefully paralleled the old federal highways, but did not obliterate them. So from Boston to Chicago, 20 was saved by not being wiped out by any turbulence. Traffic went away, of course, but the road stayed. Essentially from Chicago to the Pacific Coast, it was saved by the fact that I-90, I-80 and so on were weaving their merry way toward big cities and quietly ignoring 20. As a matter of fact, after Sioux City, Iowa, there's essentially nothing by way of a large city before you reach Boise, which isn't that large anyway, and after Boise there's nothing before the coast. There are no cities to speak of anyway west of Chicago. So that speaks to this because I don't think of myself as being a particularly emotional person, but 20, I sometimes call it the Heartland Highway, because it passes, well, it crosses 12 states, 100 counties, and approximately 400 communities, about 300 of which are dead or dying. And this is so hard to bear. This lady, 94 years old, last business in town. This lady, I get there, also the last business in town, was closing the day I arrived. Next. Lost Springs, Wyoming, the smallest bicentennial community in 1976, 7 people. Now, 1. Not her. And that one person runs the post office, general store, bar. You imagine, imagine running a bar in a town with a population of 1. You walk into the bar, you open it, okay, then you go to the counter, and you mutter your order, and then you rush around and pour yourself a drink, and so on. What happens at the end? You throw yourself out? Or I don't know. Emblem, I interviewed half the town. I interviewed half the town in the post office. The town has 15 people, I talked to 7. Van Tassel, Wyoming. Eli, Nebraska, there's nobody at all there. Next. And as I say, heartrending. I won't count that, but heartrending. That is more, that's half the students in a single Wyoming school. Total enrollment. 2 teachers, 8 grades, 8 students. This is very common out west. So go away with this thought. We, I think, rightly complain about aspects of New York State, but until you have seen rural Nebraska, rural Iowa, rural Idaho, you don't know how lucky you are, folks. You just don't. And my heart goes out to these folks because their electoral power is essentially 0. 0 because there are so few of them. And so there's no initiative on the part of our society to really help these people out. I think it's tragic. I think it's criminal, actually, what's going on out there. And maybe you hear about it sometimes, but it's huge. 20 is the umbilical cord for a great deal of that part of our world. With some fantastic roadside commercial architecture. Look at this car dealership, magnificent gas station in Correctionville, Iowa. It's a gas station. And again, because the traffic went away, because you can imagine, you're flanked by interstates, there's essentially no traffic. And there's because the traffic went away, the architecture remained. Because business has gone away, there's no point in pulling things down. It just stands there. It is truly a national museum, a national treasure. Next, including, of course, as you see, New York City. And wonderful, wonderful poem of 20, I should mention, goes through an amazing number of national parks and national sites. I haven't included those, I don't have time, we have to get to New York. Remember Field of Dreams? Field of Dreams? Dyersville, Iowa, US 20. Yellowstone, I mentioned. Indiana Dunes. This is near Craters of the Moon National Park in Psalm 20 is fantastic for the natural environment. And as well, 20 is more like a braided string than a single line. I was lucky enough many years ago to have a national guide that was published for 20 by the US 20 Highway Association, and it documented every village along the road. So I was able, in my first half transcontinental survey, to follow the exact line of original 20, which is in many instances not the current line. And what you're seeing here is the old right-of-way of 20. So whenever I travel, I try to go on the old road until the risk for my sedan is too great, as sometimes happens. Next. And accommodation, I don't want to go into that in detail, but if you look at the toilet there, this is seconds after I checked in, so the room had been cleaned beforehand, so to speak. Just to look at it makes me shiver. So, New York. Come back, I came back from my 2008 survey. That year I racked up 8,000 miles at what we're about to experience again, 8,000 miles at $4 a gallon. Remember 2008? Did about here, well, do about here. 12 corners today went up to over $3.70 a gallon. The stations there. I think here at around 350. So I had 8,000 miles worth of that on 20. So I was very excited coming back, and indeed, close to the Pennsylvania-New York line, there turns out to be an historic inn. Not too bad, except the people there weren't very nice to me. I think it was because I looked like Charles Darwin. I'd been on the road for 2 months, and you know, a cross between Karl Marx and Charles Darwin walks into your bar. And it's not that high status, but I'm sure they didn't trust me. So I didn't get a very warm welcome there, despite my excitement of returning to my home state. Next. And Route 20, one of my lifetime ambitions is to get the whole road designated as a National Historic Landmark. It does have scenic byways, and I agree this stretch is very pretty. It includes the Cherry Valley Turnpike, but this is typical Albany or Washington, D.C. They don't know where Albany is. And now the excitement. In preparing some background for this talk, I found a website, and I'm sure it was prepared by a DOT, New York DOT employee, because it documented in incredible detail all of the route numbers and rights-of-way changes in New York State, and indeed, there it was, for the first time, black and white. I had wondered for years why there were so few relict businesses on the stretch of 20 between the Buffalo area and Avon. It's sort of weird. You drive along that, no gas stations, no diners, no motels, you know. And I'd always suspected, because of course where I teach, Geneseo, 20A goes through that, I'd always suspected that 20A and 20 were in some way functionally related, and it turns out that 20A was 20 until 1939. So for approximately a 13-year period, my town, my college, stood on a transcontinental highway. Can you imagine my feeling when finally, after 25 years of working on that road, I could corroborate that. So again, that was the other thank you. I rushed in the next day. I'm telling my colleagues, they of course will think I'm crazy, a gas station, a lunatic. But that alone was something to treasure this year for me, that I could finally corroborate that. So there you go, Geneseo. transcontinental, west to the Pacific, east to the Atlantic. So, in a sense, inappropriate renovation. The worst case of that I ever saw, well, at least with things alike, in Ashtabula, Ohio, one of the glories of 20, was flying saucer gas. Who's seen that?
Orange rec means audio.
And,
The orange
on a
says rec
previous
means recording the audio.
I was planning
just
to
came
end
out
the
just
survey
recently.
at flying saucer gas. And I pull up, and dead. And then a year later, not only dead, but dead and gone. The good news is it ended up in a museum. The bad news is it would have been wonderful if it would remain in place. It's a kind of emblem of America on the road. Next. This is little known through a combination of factors that time precludes. A half of all of America's gas stations closed in the 1970s. It was a perfect storm of rising oil prices, the impact of interstates, the systematic attempts by the oil companies to reduce profit margins per gallon. A whole bunch of things went on. So that change threw something like 200,000 people out of a job in a single decade. It wasn't just the closing of the stations, of course, it was sometimes the closing of communities. And at the time, hardly ever noted. So that produced a lot of dead gas stations. Next. And in the 80s and 90s, and this is when I was working quite seriously on this, close to 3/4 of dead gas stations got reused, which, from a preservationist standpoint, gives you some hope that 20, 50, 100, 200 years from now, there might actually be at least the skeletal, so to speak, remains of gas stations. So, although sometimes the adaptive reuse wasn't very sympathetic, at least the building was still there, at least it was recognizably still a gas station. But then the EPA that had promulgated regulations as early as, I think, as the late 80s on gas station cleanup, hadn't really enforced those regulations for at least a decade, finally got serious by the end of the 80s, and so by the end of the 90s, I should say, and that pretty much put a stop overnight to reusing gas stations, because potential buyers, of course, would have assumed the sometimes horrendous cost of cleanups. You buy a gas station for $40,000, you get a $500,000 cleanup fee. So that was it. And on the more recent trips along 20, very rare to see any new business occupying a former gas station. So I personally regret that. I can appreciate the pollution issues involved and so on, but it's a shame that that side effect occurred. Next. And here we're back to the combination of essentially general store and gas. The only difference is it's not on Main Street. Next. For accommodation, again, there is a sequence, and before the automobile, there were, of course, hotels. The closest one to us that's very representative of that era is the American Hotel in Lima, which I'm sure many of you know very well. Cars come along, stopgap measures at first, tent camps to minimize the likelihood of vagrancy. Then commerce comes in, we have cabin camps. Then, for several reasons, cabin courts develop, and for reasons essentially of economy and utility installation, the units link up, so we have courts that are attached instead of separate cabins. The word motel is a little misleading. The first use of the word is in 1933 in California, but there's nothing that all different between a cabin court and a motel. It's just a terminology difference. So motels, that word is used extensively after World War II. Motel forms come in various flavors, I forms, L forms, U forms, those three in particular. And then look what happens. We're all familiar with this. Motor hotels Initially, two-story external access, more recently, multi-story internal access. B&B is a separate strand, so what do? Same thing, full circle. From hotels to, surprise, surprise, hotels. Next. So, there are survivals of the earlier era of commercial hotels along 20, the American Hotel in Lima. This one, as I recall, is Scanialis. The cabins. And I remember the eureka moment I had on this one. This is back in '94. And driving toward Albany, the Guilderland area, if you know it, it's actually west of Guilderland, and suddenly started to see cabins, and more cabins. This wasn't specifically tourist related, because after all, the tourist concentrations were at the north end of the lakes. Geneva, this is Canandaigua, etc. So why the hell are all these cabins west of Albany? Most people, I don't know if you're like me, but I would prefer to be as far from Albany as possible. So why there? And then, of course, it came to me. It's analogous to the habit of truck stops clustering on the margins of metro areas. What was happening here is that it so happens, and I've documented this in separate research from 1930s driving records, but it so happens that just west of Albany was a hard day's drive from Boston and a not quite so hard day's drive from New York City. So if you set off from either of those cities, and bear in mind, of course, 20 was the way to head west, if you set off from either of those cities, this was where, west of Albany, you'd probably want to stop overnight. I'm absolutely sure that's why we get that cluster. Unfortunately, many of these shops actually do come from '94, and on my most recent 2008 trip, quite a lot of those cabins had disappeared, which I found personally distressing, because that's an era that is, of course, fast disappearing in architectural terms. And some just classics. Look at this. Wonderful. Next. Sorry about the color balance, folks. Is it all right? I mean, you can live with the purple. To me, it looks as if I should be showing softcore pornography.
Or lilac crystal.
Oh, there you go. Handing out lilacs to everybody. Thank you. So, the trifecta. In the early automobile era, there were a number of ways, of course, in which roadside businesses tried to discourage drivers from flying by, and we begin to see synergy between the gas stations and sometimes cabin courts, or gas stations and eateries, and the Otsego is a classic example of that. These are early Depression era shots when it already combined cabins, gas, and food. Here, the shots I got in '94, here, tragically, 2008. There is a chance, however, because the property was for sale, there's a chance it's been reoccupied. Does anybody know? I missed Cooperstown this year, so is the Otsego open? Don't stay there. They always have charged far too much. In fact, I'm surprised they went out of business. Their rates were so high. But anyway, that was a bit distressing to see that site on its way out and getting intense. And the Commodore, I use this phrase here because when 20 was improved in that stretch, the 1940s realignment, the old Commodore cabin court was physically moved uphill to the new location of 20. It was notorious for many years as a night spot for persons with criminal records and somewhat Southern European last names. So you can always hear stories about the Commodore nightclub. And the cabins, they're still there. Here we've got a case of adaptive reuse. It's a storage facility. Oh well, fair enough. I can live with that. Next. The Miami, that one is fine as far as I can see, although you're not going to pay $35. Motels along all of 20 that were, if you will, California or Florida style. That is to say, they had canopies and drive-ups. So you get this sort of Florida flavor here, reinforced obviously by the name. And my goodness, what heroes to keep this one going. What a gem. My then brother-in-law took me to this when I was 11 years old in Britain, the year it opened. I suspect most of you have seen Psycho. The conventional explanation for the decline of the independent motel is that they were beaten out by the standardization and reliability of the then fairly new chains, particularly Best Western and Holiday Inn. I rather suspect, however, that the psychology of the American traveler had quickly embedded into it this particular film. However, actually proving that is another matter. And there is on 20, you got it, a Bates Motel. That's great. The Bates Motel, Idaho. Tried to talk to the owner. I thought, is it this because you want to attract a particularly weird kind of customer? Or don't people know? You know? And in fact, get this one. You know this actor's name. Yeah, Anthony Perkins. Dead now, but along 20 in New York, Perkins Motel. So he pays you money and takes a chance. Literally takes a chance. All right. So we find roadside accommodation, having gone through that phase of conventional motels and earlier cabins, coming back to first exterior access motels. This is the Governor's Inn near Albany, and all credit here to South Asian Americans. Because thousands, and I mean thousands, of struggling motels and motor hotels have not only been taken over by immigrants from South Asia, but more specifically immigrants from Gujarat, the state in India, and most specifically immigrants whose last name is Patel from Gujarat in India. Literally thousands of them. I have a student working with me right now. Her name is Priya Patel. All of her family members are involved in some way in the accommodation industry. You see little Miss Sunshine? Yeah, her uncle runs that hotel. Yeah. So she's in a tremendously empowered position, both in terms of language, culture, personal contacts, to do this wonderful survey of essentially asking this legion of Patels, how'd you get into this? How's it going? One of the questions, by the way, that does offend those moteliers is clients will walk in and say, is this motel American owned? Well, that's code. That's absolute code. And of course, the obvious answer is yes. We're citizens, just like you. That's not what they mean. And so that Priya is she'll have about 60 respondents. This one is run by Mr. Patel. Next. And one use that doesn't always work out, a lot of old motels get reused as college apartments. And time will defeat me, but one common use for the least desirable motels is to house released but paroled sex offenders. So if you want another seminar sometime, I have 2 Dutch students a year and a half ago look at the geography of convicted but released second and third degree sex offenders in New York State. And well, we can talk about this afterwards, but believe me, it would raise your eyebrows what goes on. But part of it goes on in former motels. Excellent. Well, I'll tell you, here's a statistic. Sex offenders combined in Brighton, Pittsford, Mendon, 0. Sex offenders in Canandaigua, 53. Think about that one. So afterwards, we have time, I'll explain why that is. I'm not saying that Canandaiguans are like that, no, that's not what goes on. So, diners, there are a few diners. Diner Heaven, of course, is Massachusetts. So we'll pass over this very quickly, otherwise we're going to run out of time. A few good ones. The best one, however, east of Albany, and it's just off the screen here, was being moved the day I got there. And I was so shocked, I pulled out the park where I shouldn't, and ended up with a state trooper telling me I was a very, very, very bad driver. But I got the photographs. And this is actually more like Zeb's, for instance. It's a retro diner. It's not over the middle. Attractions. A lot of these old, yeah, gone for years now. Was in East Avalon until I think the end of the 80s or the 90s. And I don't know what happened to it.
It's
on the
it's
thruway.
along the thruway by I think Irving. Yeah, right where 5 and 20, right near where 5 and 20 cross the thruway again.
And originally it was kind of mascot for a Chrysler dealership, by the way. It wasn't originally at that intersection. The local businesses owner acquired it. So yeah, I missed that because I would take photographs of visiting groups there.
I often wondered if that is the same one that was at one time downtown in Rochester, West
I
Main
think you're right. It was a Chrysler dealership. I'm almost sure you're right. Yeah. Next.
Really?
And this is a pretty happy story. Originally, come on, attractions, of course, were specifically designed to encourage people to stop instead of keep going. And next. It was a cabinet court. It was also a restaurant. I think it was also gas too. Next. And this is on a 1990 trip. I met this lady. She was dying of cancer, and this was her last season running the hotel. That was it. And goodbye to the Elms. So sad. Next. On a happier note, however, the windmill has been saved as the Seneca Falls Chamber of Commerce Visitor Center. Next. And there are two youngish women running this. They're pretty aggressive retailers. The teepee was on hard times for many years, was for sale for a long while. And it was built in 1950. It's also about 50 feet tall at the east end of the Cherry Valley Turnpike, stretch of 20. Next. And, wonderfully kitschy. Everybody liked kitsch. Yeah, I'm a big fan of kitsch. It's a cornucopia of kitsch. So if you want Indian maiden in your living room, wigwam is for you, the teepee is for you. Next. And these ladies are not only really turning this business around, but are principals in the relatively new New York Highway 20 Association. Next. And here, a curmudgeon ran this for years, and then he died. Next. It's Mr. Metz. His wife took it over, and it's back in business. They've even added soundtracks to the dinosaurs. So if you want to pick dinosaurs speaking to you, petrified. Really hokey. Hey, fine. And when I went through in 2008, I really was defeated by this enormous rainstorm, and it destroyed photographic opportunities for quite a few miles, which was tragic, because I was coming into that area of cabins. I could barely see out of the car. And it would be impossible to capture the glory of the architecture and related stories on 3,400 miles of road. All I can say at the end, though, if you ever get a chance to take 20 west, not the interstate, do that, and in particular try to do that west of the Illinois line. I'm not saying 20 in Ohio and Indiana is that great, although there are some many interesting features along there, but to touch the pulse of America out of Chicago, say we're headed on 20, and keep on it all the way to Yellowstone National Park, and particularly if you're taking younger people, children, grandchildren, show them the real America. A great road. All right, thank you, folks.
Thank you.
This reminds me of a lot of the more famous Route 66, and not unless people know about what you just said, 15 and 15A is another corridor in different states, so 15A just in this neck of the woods. The cabin type motel in East Ave not used anymore. Frank was right, had designed a gas station along Buffalo off the point. It never got built, and it foresaw that this gas station convenience store similar to the Sheets chain of gas station convenience stores in Pennsylvania. It's being built as a showpiece in a Buffalo Medium Transportation at the current time. It's not finished yet. And also Route 5, which splits off from 20 in Albany, reconnects to it in Erie, Pennsylvania, and of course runs along it between Auburn and Avon, and again, narrowing in Silver Creek. The corridor road, portion at least from Albany to Buffalo was a Honeoye trail.
Yes. Going back to your first point,
Do you remember
another
when
dream
Texaco
of mine
Town
is
was
to
open?
wake up in the middle of the night and have both melody and lyrics for a song about 20. Because as you well know, Route 66 derives essentially from two sources of fame. One is rock, and two, that song.
It used to be famous because it was the only restaurant open at night.
Drive 66 these days, you're going to be stuck on Interstate Standard Road for an awful lot of time. And to find museums in 66 can, in some parts, be quite a challenge. I should do a boost for a society I belong to called the Society for Commercial Archaeology, the SCA. And we meet annually in some kind of mecca of commercial architecture. We usually meet for 4 days. They're boring presentations like mine. And there are also field trips. So you have a camera and you're in a bus with 49 other people who are equally crazy about roadside commercial architecture. Last year we went to Fayetteville, Arkansas, and had a terrific time. So going back, there are gems everywhere, but of course you always need local people to lead you to them. So the only thing I couldn't forgive them for was I'd never been to Kansas. We were nearly on the Kansas line, and I said, okay, just drive the bus over the state line, and I've only got Alaska left. But they wouldn't do it. Every other state. So I said, maybe they should bury me there so I can get me 50. Another question. Yes, ma'am.
Could you say a little bit more about that 20A split? What was 20 we know today? What was it called? What was its route number?
You know,
and tell me where the 20 and 20A diverged.
It was very little more than a county road. But it was straight, I think, because it also happens to be a county line or municipal line. And but I don't think it was a very good road. It just happened to be straight.
And
There are
why-
plenty of straight roads.
When
I come
did-
from southern
when did-
Ontario, Canada, which is kind of like the American Midwest. You got all these straight roads, and they're terrible roads. So I really can't tell you much more than what I said, because I only,
You did have a little bit on your slide, but I was listening to you and not reading the slide. Do you have any idea why they switched in 20?
oh, well, 28 is so circuitous. That part is fairly
So
obvious.
20A was renamed 20A, and they called this telephone road, which is what it is up in.
Is that right?
The
Okay.
Legacy County.
Yeah, I
20.
honestly do not know.
It's
the
interesting.
details, yeah.
What was it just, well, maybe it was just Group 5 from East Bloomfield, west, except in.
No, I don't think
where
it
they
was-
run together.
You may be right, but I don't think so. Any other
Well,
questions?
you asked the question whether they diverged.
Where did they-
and That was
where-
mentioned, there
is it
was a
Canandaigua?
Toomey's Corners.
In
Route 28
Canandaigua?
heads south.
The common origin is Hamburg, New York.
Did they come back together again?